You're listening to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff, with co-host Eleanor Goldfield. And it is that time in the program, once again, that Eleanor and I actually get to talk with each other, which is it's always a treat for me, and I always appreciate getting to dialogue with Eleanor, whom our audience knows does amazing and incredible interviews and carries on great conversations with fantastic guests. And today, I'm going to kick things off with Eleanor talking about a few recent pieces. As you all know, we sort of cut up the headlines a bit. We talk about what's happening in the media. We talk about the state of the free press. We talk about the news that doesn't make the news and analyze why, because it's the Project Censored Show. So, Eleanor, it's great to be with you again. And one of the pieces that I know that you brought to my attention and you wanted to talk about is from Prism Reports. And it's a very the title is a profound question. We are reporting on a genocide through emojis. What does this mean for journalism? And the subtitle talks about how journalism is an integral part of social media, but what happens when platforms censor reporters? So there's a couple different directions that this article certainly is going, and I know you have some things to say about it. So, Eleanor.
Yeah, absolutely, Mickey. And I agree. It's always good and I think important to sit down with you and discuss these issues. And for those who want to check this out, it's on prismreports.org, and it was written by Anna Lakis Miller. And the first thing that you see when you look at the article is a giant watermelon. And for folks who don't know, the watermelon is a symbol of Palestine. It started because Palestinians were not allowed to fly the Palestinian flag, so then they started using the symbol of the watermelon because it has the same colors, the red, black, and green. And you've probably seen it online too, the watermelon as being used instead of using the Palestinian flag or the word. So I think this is a really important thing to highlight because it's ridiculous on its face, right? And Anna writes, quote, "Not only must we create content to capture an audience with an attention span that lasts just a few seconds, but we are also forced to normalize a form of censorship that prioritizes pleasing the algorithmic gods over engaging in honest conversations about important social justice topics such as white supremacy and settler colonialism," end quote. And it really is absurd, the idea that we can't just share information about an ongoing genocide, but then it has to be click worthy, right? It has to be something that's engaging. It's like, I don't know how to square that circle. Like it shouldn't be engaging in that creepy kind of capitalist way, but also if you are looking for that kind of content when there's a genocide going on, I fear for the direction of your moral compass. But this is and we've talked about this before, Mickey, as well, like how TikTok has become the enemy of the state simply because the US can't control the narrative. And all of these people are going on TikTok and learning about what's happening in Gaza, and that's unacceptable. And so she also points out in this article that, we have to use the symbol of the watermelon, or we write Palestine with an at symbol instead of and instead of writing genocide, there's a skull and crossbones emoji. And as she writes, according to the algorithm, I might be a terrorist. And so the algorithm is censoring people who are talking about this ongoing genocide, not just, people like Anna and other great journalists, but of course the journalists that are on the ground in Gaza sharing the genocide live streamed. As I've said before, it's the first genocide that's being live streamed in real time. This is being horrifically censored by the very same outlets that we recently covered, Mickey, are where people are going to find out the information about this genocide.
Indeed, and great coverage of that material. Anna also, writes the background, sort of the history of when you were mentioning the watermelon emoji. She writes that given that a genocide is, all of these things, violent and graphic, killing, murder, death, and so on, that gravestone or skull emojis have become a stand-in for mass slaughter of, what's now 37,000 at least, Palestinians. This coded language and this working around, and then the use of the watermelon, as you say, the history, goes back to the 1967 Israeli ban on public displays of the Palestinian flag after the Six-Day War. And the reason I bring that up, and Anna writes right in the beginning, and the reason I wanted to mention it here with you now, obviously you're well aware of this, but the corporate media, the establishment press in the US, they've conveniently contextually framed all of what's happening as if it started on October 7th, 2023. And there's so many other places we can go back. And of course, if you go back even further, people want to go back thousands of years. But as an historian myself by day, I think it's extraordinarily relevant to go back at least multiple generations to sort of see what's the back and forth that's happening here and what is the disproportionate kind of response to so-called terrorism attacks. And look, the Hamas attack is called a terrorist attack, but what spurs or causes the horror of terrorist attacks? Well, it's often state terror, right? It's often a long series of provocations and volleys. And of course, in the middle of it all, as we know over the course of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, 90% of the people that were dying in global wars were involved in the military. By the end of the 20th century, the numbers reversed. Now, most of the people that are dying in global wars are innocent civilians. As we know in Gaza, many innocent women and children. And so I think pointing out that there are many ways to censor this with language and so on, but the social media platform, algorithmic special, right, is that people are forced to spell things weird, use different font, use different emojis. And on one level, it's like, well, we're trying to beat the algorithm. But on this other level, how much are we engaging in a self-censorious act by having to utilize these platforms? And what does it say that our, quote, public square has been subsumed by a handful of major Silicon Valley big tech companies that don't have the public interest at heart, that are now more ensconced in the military and industrial complex than arguably ever before, and that have a vested interest in controlling these narratives? You mentioned TikTok moments ago, and we know publicly, both Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and Senator Mitt Romney talked openly about, at the McCain Institute, openly talked about censoring TikTok about content because somehow the youth were being brainwashed to support the rights of Palestinian people. Often censorship is something that's kind of surreptitious or it's behind the scenes, but come on. We're seeing open calls for various kinds of censorship from all over the place, including from academia and law journals. Maybe we'll talk about that in a little while. But again, I think that what's stemming around this piece is the fact that we can't seem to even come to an agreement, Eleanor, about how to share information about this, how to talk about these things, and without using clear language, we run the risk of euphemizing mass tragedies, genocide. It's pretty incredible that we're watching this happen in real time. What was another major takeaway for you, at least, in the Prism Report piece, Eleanor?
Yeah, absolutely, Mickey. I think another major takeaway for me was that, like what you mentioned about the self-censorship, and that it can happen so insidiously so that you don't even realize that you're doing it. Like I will not put the word Gaza in the title of a podcast or some kind of post that I'm doing, because I know that it's not going to be seen by even my mother. So I've started, even though I'm talking about what's happening in Gaza, I have to call it something else. And to be honest, like we've seen this in the past. I remember one of Lee Camp's most shared images from the Occupy days was a picture of a kitten. And then next to the picture of the kitten, it talked about Wall Street and how horrific it is that they own our entire government. But the fact that it was a kitten meant that it was shared so many times because everyone's like, "Oh, kitty." And so this is this kind of allowing certain images or allowing certain discussion topics to go past algorithms. This has existed for a while. It's just that now it's ramping up. And as you pointed out, Mickey, it's becoming so overt. And to the point where, this is really disgusting, but as she writes in this article, there are journalists in Gaza that are using like popular hashtags. So for instance, 22-year-old Plestia Alakad jumped on the "what's in my bag" trend to show people what she packed to flee Gaza during the genocide. So there are like these trends on Instagram where it's like, what did I buy at the store? What, what's in my bag was a trend about, like, I'm assuming what makeup or clothes you bought. And now it's being used so that people will pay attention to genocide. And as she points out, I wonder about the future of journalism when journalists themselves are beholden to algorithms that prefer "get ready with me" videos over war reporting. We can't even have a straightforward war report. I don't know that we ever really did in this country, but we really can't have it now. And this is really disgusting that we're having to like Kardashian our reporting in order to get it past the algorithms.
Yeah, the algorithms, the invisible big tech censors, right? In fact, this fall, our associate director Andy Lee Roth is spearheading a whole study on algorithmic literacy, and trying to put together curriculum for algorithmic literacy for journalists, and something that, and Andy was awarded a Reynolds Journalism Institute fellowship actually to study this and to create didactic educational documents for people to understand how this works. How do these things get censored? If we don't understand how the platform is operating, which is private and proprietary, then it's difficult for us to try to get around that. And this article that you're talking about, really highlights the fact that we're already doing this. We're already adopting ways to work around the censors. And at some point, again, back to your main one of your main points is, we need to address this kind of head on so we don't euphemize around these kind of issues. We can speak honestly and directly about these kinds of issues. So again, it's important. While it's difficult, of course, to read some of the things that we're seeing at Prism Reports, well, this is why we need public interest independent media. This is why we need journalism in the public interest, and bottom-up grassroots journalism, is because we really need to understand what's happening around the world. And there are so many efforts to try to censor what's happening, particularly right now in what's happening in Palestine with Israel, Gaza, Hamas, etc. I think that we can't draw attention to this enough.
Absolutely, Mickey. And I think that it's important also to point out, which is something that you pointed out before we started here, that the ultimate type of censorship is what we're seeing in Gaza. And as the Committee to Protect Journalists pointed out, we're recording this on June 6th, and they released a press release that on June 5th that shows that their investigations show at least 108 journalists and media workers are among the more than 37,000 people who have been murdered since this began on October 7th. Well, this particular thing began on, nothing started on October 7th, but 108 journalists and media workers. I mean, and many of these, as they've also pointed out, and you can look on their website to see more of that, you can see many of them have been targeted killings. Like several dozen have been targeted killings, which means that Israel's well aware that they're going after journalists. They're not like, oh, oops, my hand slipped. They're going after journalists as this ultimate form of censorship. And so I think that it's important to recognize that censorship is a spectrum, and that we have to fight it across this spectrum, and also recognize that the most horrific type of media censorship is what these journalists are experiencing in Gaza right now.
Absolutely. And Eleanor, the piece that you're looking at now from the Committee to Protect Journalists, just so our listeners know, you can go to cpj.org. This is the June 5 piece, Journalist Casualties in the Israel-Gaza War, which is the terminology that they're using there. And if to quote the CPJ program director, Carlos Martinez de la Serna in New York, Carlos said, since the war in Gaza started, journalists have been paying the highest price, their lives. That's the ultimate censorship here, for their reporting. Without protection equipment, international presence, communications, or food and water, they are still doing the crucial job to tell the world the truth. Every time a journalist is killed, injured, arrested, or forced to go to exile, we lose fragments of the truth. Those responsible for these casualties face dual trials, one under international law and another before history's unforgiving gaze. And let's remember, Eleanor, the IDF claims that it does not target journalists. It claims that it is not trying to silence people. They do not do this, although we know otherwise. There's a long history of the targeting of journalists. And we've certainly seen a long list of quote unquote mistaken attacks, right? That seems to be, it's a serial excuse at this juncture. A mistake is something that one makes rarely. When you have bombings and missile strikes that are killing journalists, killing people in tents that were told to, shelter in places, these are not mistakes. And it's important to call out the language that's being abused around this. This is a classic news abuse issue, clear abuse of language, clear obfuscation going on. And then, of course, the response to this stuff in the United States Congress, Eleanor, is to have a bipartisan invitation to bring Netanyahu to the United States, who is, wanted by the ICC for war crimes. So too is the head of Hamas, right? But that's how the United States responds to this. There's also further reports out that are showing that it was US-made weapons that were killing the people in the tents around Rafah. Again, we know this, but, and look, this stuff is now being reported in the establishment press. CNN did a exhaustive, detailed report of what we just said. CNN.
No.
And I'm like, what is going on? That
wild
people cannot process that this is happening. Again, it's extraordinary. And it does show a lot of how people are conditioned. And it shows that we have a lot of work to do, Eleanor, in figuring out how we communicate with people and finding out why they may have these ideas or thoughts or beliefs about what's happening and how best to counter it. And as you and I mentioned, independent media often is a great way to introduce people to these counter narratives based on evidence, the degree to which that we're not trying to push people in a direction saying, I'm right, you're wrong, no matter what, or which is what they're doing in reverse. But it's how do we get people to see their own inability to see around what they're conditioned to look at, right? How can we expand that frame? And Eleanor, I know, as you said earlier, it may have been off air, but when we're talking about the numbers and casualties, there's so many people still buried under rubble. We don't know even the extent of the tragedy. And as I spoke with historian Peter Kuznick last week, he said that he surmises there's well over 50,000 people that have been killed, not to mention however many more journalists that would be. But there was another piece that you brought to my attention. Middle Eastern and Muslim media workers are facing retaliation for covering Gaza. A new report details cases of retaliation and discrimination against media workers advocating for Palestinian liberation and against the killing of journalists in Gaza between October 23 and this past February. This is a piece by Alexandra Martinez, also at Prism Reports. Eleanor, can you tell us a little bit about what's happening with this story, another related for our topic today?
Yeah, absolutely, Mickey. So this story came from, or this report is by the Freelance Solidarity Project, which is the digital media division of the National Writers Union, and they created a report documenting retaliation that workers in the media industry have faced, and they focused on media workers of Middle Eastern or North African descent and those identifying as Muslim. So this does not mean that those who don't identify as that have not faced retaliation, but as listeners might be aware, we live in a white supremacist, very anti-Muslim, anti-African and Middle Eastern society. So those people are going to face more retaliation more often than not. And so this report, titled Red Lines: Retaliation in the Media Industry during the war on Gaza, was released last month, right after World Press Freedom Day, and recorded 44 cases of retaliation affecting more than 100 media professionals between October 7th and February 1st. So listeners might note that this is February 1st. So this is before we see the college encampments start up. And so there's probably likely, and the Freelance Solidarity Project makes this note, that there's going to have been more since February, right? We don't have the resources to do this work, but we wanted to create kind of a snapshot and show folks what this looks like. And their research encompassed international cases, although they point out that the majority of reported incidents originated in the United States.
Mm.
So the report found that workers of color, particularly Muslim and Arab media professionals, face disproportionate impact. Um, in one instance at the LA Times, a group of 38 workers signed a letter protesting the targeting and killing of journalists in Gaza and were told they could not cover anything related to the war after they signed the letter. And of those 38 workers, more than 25 were workers of color.
Over half, more than half.
More than half. And
Yeah.
additionally, the report highlights the impact on freelance workers,
Mm.
a significant factor considering that more than 30% of journalists are freelancers. And I think that this is important because they point out that you don't have that workplace solidarity. And it's easier for this kind of retaliation to pass unnoticed because the employer can just say, oh, it can just say, we're not taking your pitches anymore, or can just not respond. And as a freelance writer myself, I know that that's something that could easily happen. And then it would be on me to try and prove that it had anything to do with specific reporting or a specific stance that I took. And they also point out that unions can be a powerful tool against this kind of retaliation.
Yeah,
They
so
point
how so? Yeah, that's a very fascinating and important connection of labor protecting workers, particularly protecting marginalized workers. In this case, we're talking about journalists that are people of color, Eleanor.
Yeah, so they point out that Hearst Magazine's union was actually successful in pushing back against a social media policy that the company was trying to push, which would have limited what their workers were allowed to say on social media to only things that were consistent with the company's stated positions, which is just absolute, like that's so
Not
absurd.
journalism. That's just
No,
not
it's
journalism.
just not. You're right. And so that was one of those instances where a union was able to have that collective power and push back and say, nope, that's not what we're doing here. But considering how few people are actually in unions, and again, that 30% are freelance writers, there are a lot of people that are left out in the cold with these principled positions that have nowhere to go. And she also points out that we've been watching mass layoffs and media organizations basically collapsing under the weight of these kind of retaliations. And there's nowhere for these people to go, especially freelancers, because again, the weight of that proof is on your shoulders to try and say, well, it's because of this. So it is frightening to see how much retaliation has come just on this one topic, which of course means, Mickey, that there's retaliation on a lot of other topics too. It's just that right now we're very much focused on this one.
Eleanor, what a phrase. If there's a pull quote for our conversation right there. There is retaliation on a number of issues, including labor itself, including having these corporate outlets report about labor with that innate bias, right? So somehow if you're a labor organizer, you're biased, but if you're writing for the corporate press, you're objective. The double standards abound. And again, this is another extraordinary report we found at prismreports.org. This was by Alexander Martinez on Middle Eastern and Muslim media workers facing retaliation for covering Gaza. So a couple reports there. We've talked about the CPJ. And Eleanor, we've got a few minutes left. I wanted to bring it back to the table another example of censorship, this being a violation of academic freedom in particular. And this one is a serial issue because this is a scholar in an article that was originally written by a Palestinian human rights lawyer. It was censored by Harvard Law last year. The Nation and a few other places wrote about this. And in a recent article here at Common Dreams, June 5, Brett Wilkins writes, "What are they afraid of? Columbia Law Review Board shuts down website over Nakba article." And so a legal scholar, the author of a 106-page piece, said that the suppression attempt is reflective of a pervasive and alarming Palestinian exception to Palestinian freedom. So just as a little background, the Columbia Law Review Board, Wilkins writes, the board of directors temporarily shut down the prestigious journal's entire website following its publication of an article arguing for the establishment of the Nakba, or ethnic cleansing of Arabs from Palestine, to establish and expand the state of Israel as a novel legal concept. So, Eleanor, do you know, have you followed anything around this? I mean, this was an extraordinary effort to just some of the language that's been used is they just nuked the whole site, and they just simply claimed that the website was under maintenance, and it was still under maintenance midway through the week. Apparently, I guess censorship is a hard thing to maintain. Eleanor, any of your thoughts around this?
Well, and I think, Mickey, I think this speaks to and as the title says, what are they afraid of? And the full quote is, what are they afraid of? Of Palestinians narrating their own reality and speaking their own truth? Yes, that's exactly what they're afraid of, because that's why, of course, they're targeting journalists. As the person from CPJ pointed out, every time a journalist dies, they take that truth with them. And so this is why journalists are being targeted. This is why people are trying to find workarounds for the algorithm, because the algorithm doesn't want Palestinians to be telling their own stories. They don't want them to be proving and pointing out that Israel is an apartheid state committing genocide. They don't want that, because that goes against the United States stance, this very hyper-Zionist stance with Israel as a U.S. colony, basically, formerly a British colony. And so I think that this is exactly what they're afraid of. And I mean, this ties all of what we've been talking about together, because anybody who's willing to uplift the voices of Palestinians, anyone who's willing to uplift the reality of what's happening on the ground there, is going to be retaliated against, is going to be censored, is going to have an entire website shut down. You know, you name it. The tactics are really myriad when it comes to this. And this is why I also think it's important that we remember that the system is rigid in its ideology, but it is very malleable in its tactics. And it is so important that we remember that censorship looks a lot of different ways, and it comes in a lot of different forms, and we have to combat that however we find it. And I would just say that I'm very glad that they've found a place to put this up. But I would say that this is something that we have to be very aware of is going to continue happening as long as people are willing and able to share the reality that goes against any kind of U.S. stance, be that Gaza, be that labor rights, be that climate chaos, be that indigenous rights, you name it.
Yeah, and the human rights lawyer and scholar Rabea Egbarhaya, this is article, and to quote him saying, "By attempting to silence and censor my scholarship, these two law reviews have actually amplified it." Right, as we've argued at the project for a long time, censorship has a way of backfiring, right? Where the Streisand effect, or well, as it's also called in the pop culture. He goes on to say that, quote, "And by attempting to erase the Nakba, they have in fact made it clearer. And still, despite this irony, it feels quite offensive and unprofessional and discriminatory to be faced with such repression." And again, going back to Romney and Blinken, the U.S., not only is the U.S. Congress inviting Netanyahu to the Congress to speak freely, they're simultaneously trying to shut down any platform, any student protest, legal scholar, journalist. I mean, just fill in the blank. You said the tactics are myriad, but the targets are very clear. The message that they're trying to suppress becomes clearer as the efforts grow to silence them. And I think it's important on this kind of program that we keep calling attention to those efforts. And instead of, trying to beat people over the head with truth sticks and whatever the facts are, I think if we keep pointing this out and letting people see that this is unequivocally, this is happening. There is a gross overt form of various gross overt forms of censorship happening right before our very eyes. And it's not just the backdoor algorithms and the shadow banning and the demonetizing and the things that we've talked about for a long time. This is now in your face, old school censorship. Yeah. And I think if we don't stand up to it and we don't call this out, this doesn't even mean we have to agree with what this human rights lawyer writes or says. It means that we should never tolerate these institutions saying you don't have a right to see it.
Absolutely. And I think this comes back to that question that I've asked on the show before, which is, what is so scary about it that you had to censor it, that you couldn't allow it to be debated in the open?
Yeah. And I think that's That's probably a good note to end on, and we could probably end every show ever into the future with that quote, because it's a really overarching question. And what's at stake? Who are the interested parties? Why is it that so many people in Congress have this bipartisan support for what's happening with Israel? And then, of course, we go and start looking at the lobby money and the defense contracts and how much money and donations and foundation support are there that comes from organizations supporting Israel that are in higher education. I mean, when we start using the critical media literacy lens here that asks those kinds of questions, the answers start to become a little clearer, right? And we start to really see that there are concerted efforts, outside efforts, right? We hear over and over, Russia, China, trying to take over the disinformation campaign. Nancy Pelosi's worried about the Russian bots coming for us. Michael Douglas is worried we're being brainwashed. Meanwhile, they're inviting one of the lead brainwashers, Bibi, to come here and continue to rinse the brains of Congress.
Well, and Mickey, to your point about how even legacy media is somewhat like inching towards the bandwagon here, the New York Times this morning, again, we're recording this on June 6th, published an article that's called, the headline is Israel secretly targets U.S. lawmakers with influence campaign on Gaza war. Subheadline being Israel's Ministry of Diaspora Affairs ordered the operation, which used fake social media accounts. Geez, does that sound familiar?
Yes.
Urging U.S. lawmakers to fund Israel's military. Would you call that meddling in someone's politics? Like,
I'm sorry, Eleanor, our signal seems to have gotten very fuzzy. What was that again? The New York Times reported what? Oh, it wasn't Russia, but some other country is trying to manipulate us during an election year with bogus social media accounts. And it's not Macedonian teenagers. It's not St. Petersburg. It's not coming from Putin. Yeah, well, look, we know sometimes it might be coming from Putin, but we have ironclad evidence that this is happening from Israel, yet you're not allowed to point it out or else you're anti-Semitic. This is absolutely absurd. I'm so glad that you pointed that out because that's exactly the report that I was paraphrasing and talking about moments ago. And it's important to note that it is the New York Times.
Yeah.
Even they are coming around to saying these things.
Well, welcome, New York Times.
Yes. And guess what? I welcome them.
Yes, I would
open arms to do this kind of reporting versus what they were doing months ago, right?
And still do.
And still do. But it is heartening to see that there are some cracks in that facade. And again, people really just need to understand that censorship is not the way to handle these complicated and difficult issues. We need to have open dialogue, and we need to we really need to resist the efforts of one side or another to tell anybody what they're allowed to see, read, hear, or express.
Amen.
So, Eleanor, it's been another half hour that has zipped by, and I'm glad that we were able to talk about some of these issues. Again, I'm Mickey Huff with Eleanor Goldfield. You're tuned to the Project Censored Show. And we do this once or twice a month. Eleanor and I talk about key issues. We talk about the news that doesn't make the news. We analyze why. And we hope that it may work to broaden, if not maybe our audience's media horizons. Maybe this gives you some more information where you can talk to your friends or family or other people in your lives. And you can say, hey, have you considered these different sources of information? Have you looked at these other issues? Have you heard these kinds of narratives before? Because I think it takes, it takes more than a village. It takes all of us to really contribute to changing the discourse and kind of changing the environment around these issues, Eleanor.
Absolutely, Mickey. I couldn't agree more. And just like your food diet, your media diet should be diverse and come from good places.
Indeed. And that about does it for another episode of the Project Censored Show. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll definitely see you next time.